Hello everyone, Kurt Holford here and welcome back to another Holfeder Labs. This is going to be a special video here. It's meant to be a video that is to continue a discussion that was done in another video done by Arms and Armor. The link will be in the description below to that video. And I am wanting to, every once in a while, I don't know about you, but sometimes there's videos out there that you see and you're like, wow, I really wish I could be in that conversation right now, because it's one that really piques your interest. It's something that focuses on, and it's a question of like, what are you trying, like, I really want to be in that because of the value of what they're saying. And this video right here, especially, I think was incredibly important to discuss upon, because the reality is it's one that I know for myself, it is something that strikes very near and dear to my heart, especially as a martial artist, because of things I did not understand about swords when I was getting further and further into the practice. When I was first starting off in the practice. So with that being the case here, I just wanted to take a second here. So first and foremost, to thank the people at Arms and Armor for putting that out there. I love your work, not just your videos, but also your blades too. So I appreciate those. So I just wanted, so again, to continue the conversation, one of the things that was brought up in the discussion is the notion of training off of replicas of replicas. And I for one, really appreciated that, because a big part about that we may be missing in this is the context of how things handle, how they're not all like a assembly line process feeling of equipment. And that in many cases, swords kind of feel like, to me, like many of them are personal in design. So one thing that I will say first and foremost here is that I surely do not have the handling experience that the people at Arms and Armor have in regards to holding onto historical pieces. I have had the absolute wonderful experience of being able to experience holding them on a few occasions, and being able to see them in museums and whatnot. And they do feel incredibly different. And that's actually one of the reasons why I really try to focus my training the way that I do, both in videos but also in classes, is because a lot of times the way that the fetters that we may see within the sport are how they're designed, they don't necessarily replicate how swords feel. And I think it's very interesting and important to kind of talk about, because the thing is, like, there's parts from my story of understanding, right, that I didn't quite understand what I was getting into. I didn't know what I was doing. And, after, initially I was part of much of the culture. It's like, sword, this looks like something I've seen on television. And, I didn't have the background or anything like that to really take a look at that and to say, there's more to this than just like, it's a sword. A sword's a sword's a sword. So one of the things that I noticed for me was that there was a point in time where I started off with this. I had rings on the fetters that I was using, and that's because I was I am a huge Witcher nut, and I love the ring guards on that. The thing is, though, they are out of context to, one, it's a game. Second of all, they are a later period concept. And third of all, they don't necessarily represent everything that I was studying within a tradition. And, it took me some time to understand that. And also it took me, taking rings off to make me realize, I'm not actually doing the technique because I have this added device there, at least for the period that I was studying and whatnot. I think that's a very important piece to talk about, is because, again, context is key, right? So, you don't talk about defeating a knight with a Glock 22, 40 caliber pistol. These things would have met. So these are things right here where if you're talking about 14th century arms, you should be talking about 14th century arms. And that's a big part that informs the practice of the time. So I think that's a big part right there that I had some recollections on that. And again, it was Shielhow that this happened on. And, it got to a point where I wanted to change the practice and focus of how I was doing this, because at the end of the day here, I started to realize I wasn't necessarily replicating what I was doing. So I started to work with people that, manufacturers, and started making fetters that were shorter. And, it's funny because one of the things that Nathan had talked about within the video was about how, essentially, there was an individual who came up and saw a sword and said, that's not a long sword, it's not the right handle length. I had a similar experience at a tournament when I was still going, where I brought one of my shorter fetters. And I say shorter, but the reality is that I have a type that I really like, and it's based off of the Albion Mercenary, which I really like that design. And I started making all the swords I could based off this design. So I feel the length was good, the handling was really optimal, and it really made a lot of my practice, I think, excel, because I was focusing on a style that I believe was optimal to replicating the system that I was doing. Well, at this tournament, because I was at a cutting tournament, a fighting tournament, and one of the things that ended up happening with that was so one person came up and I was out there warming up before we're doing whatever for the cutting, and I'm using, for the cutting tournament, and I'm using my fetter, for anyone that knows, my conviction, which is like, I call it conviction. You have to step in with conviction because it's not nearly as long as some others. And someone came to me and was like, it's interesting that you're using a side sword for a long sword. I thought that was my first time experiencing it. I was like, I'm kind of surprised by this. So I walked over and I said, well, no, this is a long sword. I was like, no, the handle's too short. And again, it was funny to hear this, because when I was hearing Nathan talk about it, I was like, I've had that same exact experience. So I remember taking this over, and I said, well, and I remember opening up the case where my sword was for the cutting portion of it. And I said, what would you call this? And they said, well, that's a long sword. And I laid down the fetter right next to it, and they were like, wait a minute. And I think that's a part right there that I don't think everyone thinks about. And much like, I want to follow the example that Nathan and Craig were talking about in the video. It was like, this isn't saying anything bad or wrong, not at all. But there are things about this that make artificiality portions right here that make us want to have an outcome with swords rather than seeing what the outcome is with swords, which is one of the things that I try very hard to replicate, to understand. Now, admittedly, I'm a single person operation when it comes down to the budgetary process of this. So I kind of get what I have for availability for certain pieces out there. And that right there in itself does show about some of the limitations of being able to do some of those kind of things. But one of the things about this right here that is very important to understand is that I absolutely agree with what Nathan and Craig were talking about, is like how we don't know a lot of the stuff about how these things operate, how they handle. And I think in many ways industry has, and that because we have a sport. We have a sport today, much like Kendo. And I'm a person that did Kendo for the better part of 10 years. I still do the kata and whatnot. And I use the shinai for, and for anyone that knows, those are the bamboo swords that they use for striking within the sport of Kendo. They don't represent how Japanese swords actually handle at all. And they are a training device that allows people to perform this art with the equipment that they have there to score points and to do things and to demonstrate things within that practice of martial arts, or that sport. But then they also have other things that categorize going up. And eventually, if you go into different disciplines, you'll start moving away from shinais, and you'll start going into other things where like it ceases to be about fighting and becomes about forms and kata and everything else, where they're starting to use blunt swords, and they're not striking each other like we do in our practice of the historical martial arts of, within Europe and whatnot. But more along the lines, they use it for forms and striking everything else, and it's a way for them to practice their art. Another part about this right here that I think is very important here is that while I absolutely love my fetter conviction, I ceased using it, especially because a lot of the times I just started to move away from the whole tournament scene. And again, not because it was bad or anything like that, but just because, once again, I got to a space where I started to ask myself, I was like, okay, this feels really cool, but there's still some parts right here that I don't understand. As people have seen on this channel here, I do a lot of sharp work. I talk about how blades bind. That in itself is a huge part, that is a component that is missing. The other part that's missing in this, however, This is actually more of a recent thing that happened, is that swords break and swords become really, and as strong as they are, they're also really kind of brittle in certain aspects. And while they were absolutely really, really robust in comparison for the time, they are not nearly as robust as some of these sport line swords are, which do not have edges that taper down directly to an edge. They're round and robust, and they are made for impact striking versus binding and striking in certain ways and cutting and whatnot. So these are big parts right here that I think are very important to discuss, because in many ways, again, these are parts right here that I had to really look for myself. And for example, the reason why this is interesting for me that came up is because there was a discussion thread about a specific sword line that I, again, also really favor, by Black Fencer. And there was a few complaints in there about how they don't withhold for sparring. Well, I had an experience where I fall down the similar spot when I'm using a Black Fencer blunt, which is incredible for the replication of how swords feel and work, in my opinion. I think they're really fantastic for that. But they're not constructed with the edges being very robust to being like, okay, I'm gonna, I can take a lot of impact. They're made more like blades. And they're a lot more rigid in comparison to fetters. And these types of concepts right there have effects. So if you're buying a blunt sword, it may be beneficial to understand, and I'm certainly not an expert in this. I only can see what I've seen on television and listen to people like Nathan and his team up there. When they talk about how swords are made. So a lot of times too, there's a lot of discussion about how edge work and everything else works and how blades work and whatnot. And I think that's a huge part that is absolutely missing, because the game now becomes more about striking first and less. And I would actually wager that many of the blows that are happening would probably snap a lot of blades. And on top of that, we may not necessarily be having the same kind of longevity of a sharp sword, right, that you would have in comparison to a blunt one. And this all changes perspective and handling and feel, and that becomes very hard to kind of quantify, because at the end of the day here, for myself, when I started to move further and further away from sharp swords and how they handle, and also swords that may have been in period to handle, and also maybe conflating, like, oh, I'm going to use a sword. What's a sword? I have a sword in my hand here. It's all the same, and that's not necessarily accurate either. I think in the video, one of the things that was said is that the people that made these things were some of the smartest people, if not the smartest people within weapon tech of the time, and we're recreating those things. So they knew how to get these things out there to the people that needed to do it. A lot of the stuff we utilize for the sport today is for the conjunction of a game that is tag-based. And again, I think that it's great for reflex building. There's things in there that are very important to build up on. However, they don't handle the same way as swords do, as a sharp sword works. And, also, how a sharp sword handles or works is also relative to the time. Because one of the things that was brought up in the discussion was about how rapier, which I don't study rapier, I'm a very, very 14th century focused person when it comes down to my martial arts practice. But rapier can be very whippy and fast, but they also can be very clunky and heavy. And one of my students was talking about how when they were reading a manuscript, about how apparently there's some people that would just get a really long rapier and run at the person. It wasn't about sword work, because it was about killing the person or hitting them first. So why would I want a sword that's very whippy if my whole point is to put the thing out there and run at them, or really or aggressively move? I don't want them to displace offline. So again, this is where the big culmination portion, I think that I'm hoping that the people from Arms and Armor do speak back on this, because again, I love your work, and Nathan, I've got to fight with him in the lists, not against him, but in the same lists and whatnot. We're in the main deed at WMAW, and then we also got to fight in the field in a field exercise at the Red Knight a couple of years back, and he's just a jolly soul that there's a huge heart for all this. And I really hope that the people from Arms and Armor ask questions, talk, add something, because I think that this is such an important conversation to have. And it is not to say that anyone is doing anything wrong. There is no wrong in this. It's just that if we're trying to understand how these things work, there's some things that we step away from. So this brings me to what I really kind of want to add to the conversation. And I don't know how relevant this is or anything else, but one thing I don't have the answer to, and I don't think we have the answer to as far as for early traditions within the art. But essentially, I kind of get the sense that these things are a lot more personalized to somebody, right? And that to the concept of what they're saying about train with a replica of a replica. I kind of wonder if there are people in the community out there that think, oh, well, hey, you know what? This is just how swords are. And because of that right there, if I go to my good smith over here and I pay my shillings, whatever the case may be, I'm going to get the exact same thing that's out there. Almost like an automobile industry kind of like replication process, where I think this is my opinion, and this could be one of the reasons why, when they're talking about the rapier, but also many of the early medieval swords, some of them feel very, very different in hand. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that we're talking about they were customized to fit a person. And that makes me feel like the people that were doing these things, these aren't your local blacksmiths doing, shoes. These are people that are, they're the combat elite and the elitists of the time, and they have the ability to be measured and taped and everything else to this. Well, it's an anomaly to me. When people talk about armor, how personalized armor is, and as we go further into the works, we'll see how that goes. Armor is really personalized, and it's while it certainly does become very munitions based, munitions grade, and you pull off the shelves. A lot of the upper end, really beautiful pieces is less of about it's not just something off the shelf. It's highly tailored. It's like clothing. I can't imagine that the combat professional of the time, when I say combat professional, I'm not talking about like a foot soldier, and those are certainly professionals, but I'm talking about of the caste professional, so like the knight. I can't imagine them having, spending really a lot of copious amount of money on something that allows them to move and to fight and defend very well, and then to not have something that is used to fight against that, not personalized. And I oftentimes look at some of I've only had the chance to look at like 4 pieces. 2 were longsword. One was a sword that was broken halfway down the blade, and the other one was by a chance I got to see one in a museum. The other ones were over at the 2019 Long Point. So I got that, like I said, it was very interesting, and they feel very light. And they are to me, they almost feel like just really like long knives. But again, why would they be so personalized in this? And that's partially because I think that it goes down to the person, right? So we're holding something that was not necessarily made for us, in my opinion. And I don't know. This is just my thoughts. We're holding something that was very specialized to fit the body of somebody who does this for real. And we are trying to force our bodies onto a design that's not really for us to do. And I think in the modern era, what we've done, and I do agree with this, is we've seen modifications of these types of swords that are out there that allow people to do very well at cutting competitions, and do other things that are out there. They do very well for a modern practice that is not necessarily the same kind of concept that would have been historically done. And I know some people might be like, well, they must have been more robust, or there's other things that could have been factors to this. And this is certainly the case. But also, given the time, the time frame of manufacturing and product design, there's a lot there that may or may not be, the same type of quality of material that we have today. While certainly, most likely, the very best that those professional craftsmen would make, they could use it for the hands, they get their hands on, it doesn't mean that their product quality was the same. One thing about this right here is that, again, one of my students had brought up the fact that, in many ways, especially when it comes down to like certain Eastern practices, it was never about our concept of best materials had nothing, is not what they were thinking. And I don't know this is the case from a Western martial arts, a Europe-centric concept, but I think it might be something to look into. Because one of the things that was brought up was how, in many cases, the swords that were being manufactured within his region of the world of study, they weren't looking for the best things that would make a sword. They were looking for the best things that fit the person. So a person was born on this day, under this moon, or this, and they would pull materials to facet that to swords. And it becomes much more of a religious symbol. I know that was certainly something that many Japanese swords had done a similar practice. It's a very spiritual concept. And I can't imagine that might be one of the reasons why we don't have like a consistency of what we might expect in the modern era for metal material, right? But we have instead is like a variety, because maybe they were looking at something similar. And again, the sword being almost like a deity, effigy kind of status of things. I don't know. And again, like I put that out there because I think that's super fascinating. And I don't think the medieval world was so like stringent, like cast off into just like people over here. There's the Silk Road and travel happened, so people talked, and I can't wrap my head around how it could have been very different in that. But again, like that I don't know that. I think that is something to consider, and I'm kind of curious if people know anything about that. So that's really going to wrap it up for this video right here, because one of the big things about this right here, when it comes down, I saw this video, I watched it twice, and I was like, yes, we need more of these kind of conversations, because I know for myself, I got really lost in what was effective for the modern sport tournament. And I felt like that moved me away from the historical work, the art, the material culture of things. And I am certainly not there for all my stuff, but I do my best for what I have to try to understand things at a raw basis. And I think that that's a big part that I know myself I struggled with, because I stopped focusing on one thing, and I started focusing on everything that was out there and conflating a lot of things that really had no place in period of time, usage, or other parts about that. So training with replicas of replicas of replicas of replicas, that is absolutely something that is a factor and a huge limitation. It's a huge limitation. It doesn't make it that it's, it doesn't make that it is, bad. It just means that it is what it is. And I think that is a part right there that is super important to look at, because especially, for example, one of the things they're talking about, how the tip of the sword being like less than 1 mil thick. That is very thin. In my opinion, very sharp. And that puts a very different perspective on like the usage. Because as thin as it is, it's probably not as robust as something that's thicker. So the usage of it is also very specific. So, like I said, that's going to do it for this video here. Take a look at the video. Like I said, it's linked in the description below. Love Arms and Armor. Love what they do out there. Again, I'm a big fan of them. I also like Albion. I think that they make incredible work out there for people. And they're just really good. They're just really good folk, in my opinion, that also love geeking out about this stuff too. So, to you all out there, I hope that you continue to strive in your business. I appreciate what you do out there for that. Thank you, Arms and Armor, for putting that video out, because I think it is a very important conversation piece. And I just want to add my part right here. Again, not to challenge at all, but like to add to it, because I really, really liked that conversation. I think it was very important. So thank you for that. And for everybody else out there, please don't forget, like, subscribe, share with a friend, leave a comment. Let me know what your thoughts are about this video, or the Arms and Armor video itself too. I'd like to hear what your thoughts are on this. Again, please understand, none of this is attack. This is an honest conversation about like looking at materials and trying to understand what is present for our usage of practice. So just let me know what your thoughts are below. And as always, until I see you, please stay safe out there, train well, and fight on. I'll see you all soon.